gut is often called the second brain. Is this
Hmm.
accurate? How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think it can be thought of as accurate. I like to call it the other brain rather than the second because it's really hard to provide an accurate ranking, right? And second implies a couple of things. It either implies that it's inferior to the primary brain, or in some way it developed second. And in either case, it's hard to make that argument, right? So I like to refer to it as the other brain, given how intimately they are connected and they work together. In fact, some lines of evidence can be cited to make the argument the other way almost. So if you think about nerve endings, the enteric nervous system, which covers the gut, there's more nerve endings in the brain than there are in the enteric nervous system, so the brain wins out on that. But when it comes to information, we think of the gut-brain connection to the vagus nerve as a bidirectional highway because information goes both ways. But about 80% of the neurons are afferent, meaning that 80% of the information actually goes from the gut to the brain versus from the brain to the gut. And so only about 20% of the information on that bidirectional highway comes from the brain to the gut. So what seems clear is that the gut is certainly feeding the brain more information, which means that the gut has access to more information about what's happening to the body. The brain is interpreting that information, of course, and then taking action. But the question becomes, if you're trying to rank it, like, how do you rank it?
Hmm.
It's who takes more action and who has more information,
Hmm.
and so I think they're just amazing partners, and they develop from the same tissue in the embryo, and at the same time, in the same polar region of the embryo. So they're really two parts of the same system.
What kind of information is the gut responsible for? Like, I understand, like, the brain is responsible for, me raising my arms here and talking. What is
Mm-hmm.
my brain interpreting with the gut's information?
So there's a number of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So nutrient status is one. What is the caloric levels coming in? What are the sugar levels coming in? Proteins, carbohydrates. So the brain gets a lot of information about the type of nutrients and the distribution of nutrients, and then the brain can then make assessments and demands on the body accordingly. For example, if there's not a lot of carbohydrates coming in through the gut, that becomes known to the brain, and then there could be an energy issue in the brain because the brain counts on carbohydrates and glucose for energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, the brain can then activate the liver to release more glycogen into the blood to supply it adequate energy. The gut is also telling the brain about the amount of food that's coming in, right? So that the brain can activate the appropriate satiety signals or metabolic signals to start the digestive process, or manage hunger, manage cravings and things like that. So then it's giving the not only nutrient status but frequency and volume of eating, and then certain micronutrient availability as well is being signaled to the brain from the gut, and then from metabolization of those micronutrients into active metabolites, there's signals going up to the brain in terms of whether the system is in a parasympathetic mode or sympathetic mode, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, which then helps the brain turn on the right mechanisms to support parasympathetic or sympathetic function, right? So there's a lot of things, and then now there's evidence that there's immune communication between the vast array of immune tissue that's found in the gut, and then of course the lymphatic and lymphatic systems associated with the brain, and all the microglia cells, which are like the macrophages of the brain and central nervous system. They're learning about what's in the environment, what the dangers are, what the brain should be extra aware of in terms of protection. So all of that
Mm-hmm.
defensive information is coming through as well.
That's really interesting. So the gut, when it's trying to interpret micronutrients and things like that, if we're eating like these junk food, like these empty calories, like these chocolate bars, Oreos, things like that, if we were to eat a more micronutrient dense food, would that then trigger satiety sooner based off of what the gut is interpreting in that food?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's part of the problem with the standard American diet, right? Because it's calorically dense but nutrient depleted.
Hmm.
And as a result of that, you can have ongoing, hunger signals despite getting more than adequate calories to support function. And part of that is because of the nutrient depletion and the inadequacy of the micronutrients from the food itself. The brain is getting signals that, hey, they need to eat more because we're starving from these nutrients, right? Or particular amino acids and so
Hmm.
on. So yeah, that's absolutely, a thing that we see in the Western world is this issue around hypercaloric, hyperpalatable, low nutrient dense foods leading to massive amounts of metabolic dysfunction because the brain keeps telling you to keep eating.
Hmm. When we are talking about the gut, what are we talking about? What does the gut entail? And then what is the difference between a healthy gut or a good gut and a not healthy one or bad gut?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of this is often conflated. Oftentimes I hear people talking about the gut and they're really primarily referring to the stomach.
Mm.
And they're talking about what's happening in the stomach and all the digestive functions within the stomach. I hear people talking about the gut and then they're talking about the entire digestive tract from the stomach all the way down to the distal colon. Um, when I'm referring to gut health in general, what I'm really referring to is the microbiome within the digestive system
Hmm.
that controls not only the digestive process, but the immune system, the neurological system, and then has significant impact on the rest of the body as well. Everyone's heard of the gut skin axis, the gut brain axis, the gut liver axis, right? So all of these exist because there's clear demonstration that things that are happening in the gut are significantly impactful to other systems in the body. So when I talk about gut health, what I'm really referring to is what is the microbiome doing in the entire digestive tract, right? And
Hmm.
and that you have to start considering from the mouth all the way down to the distal colon. It's not as much focused on just the digestive process itself that's enveloped within it, but it's more about what is this a massive terrain. How does it function? What is it doing? How is it either driving health or driving disease? And that's an important thing about gut health that people need to understand is that your microbiome works on a spectrum, right? So if we imagine on this far right hand side of the spectrum, it is the optimal microbiome, which will address what that looks like, right? What optimal gut health looks like. But let's say it's the optimal microbiome. It is supporting the system at every turn, right? So it's supporting digestion, assimilation of nutrients, the immune system, all of the neurological function that's required, all of the hormone balancing, everything, right? So it's doing all that. It's facilitating health, and it's also helping build resilience within the host because it's providing a whole degree of capability that the host doesn't innately have that allows the host to be resilient, right? So, and that's things like even degrading microplastics for you or detoxifying things that are coming into the system and so on. So that's one end. The other end of the spectrum is a microbiome and a gut that's not only not doing all that stuff, it's actually actively driving disease process, right? And most people's gut are somewhere in that spectrum where it's like a little bit leaning towards disease process. It's still doing some basic core functions, or it's doing a lot of core functions, slightly leaning towards a disease process in certain aspects. So it's somewhere on that spectrum. And our goal should be always to be engaging in behaviors that keep driving us towards the far right,
Hmm.
right? Um, so so that's an important thing for people to really grasp and understand because really at the end of the day then what moves the needle towards the right in this case is that a lot of little choices that you make throughout the day, right? It's not one miracle probiotic or it's
Hmm.
not a special, tool or technique or a biohack that's going to do it, right? It's a culmination of decisions that happen throughout the day, every day of the week, every week of the month, and so on. And that culmination of decisions starts moving it this way or moving it to the left. And what I'm always passionate about is teaching people how to understand the gut
Mm-hmm.
as a whole so that they can understand what are the decisions to be made, on a day-to-day basis to drive it to the right. And then to go back to your other part of your question about, what is a healthy or good health, a gut in good health look like? And I'm always starting to think about it first from the microbiome perspective, right? Because um, a healthy microbiome impacts your gut immensely and in fact dictates how it functions in
Mm-hmm.
large part. So what does a healthy microbiome look like? A healthy microbiome can be best described as one with high diversity, and that's what we call alpha diversity, which is the number of individual organisms in the microbiome. But nowadays, what is becoming clear is it's not just the number of organisms, it's the distribution of those organisms as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have good diversity if you have, say, 500 species in your gut, but 50 species make up 90% of the population, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other 450 species make up 10% of the population. That's still not good distribution, so it's not good diversity. So we want a high number of viable species, but we also want some degree of uniformity. And then the second part of it, which is now a more recent nuance on the microbiome, is understanding the proportionality of the pathobionts that are in that diversity number,
Mm-hmm.
right? So pathobionts are basically collections of organisms that have pathogenic potential. They can be beneficial as well, but when their numbers reach certain threshold levels, they tend to act more pathogenic than beneficial, right? And so you could have somebody that when you count each individual species, they look like they have amazing diversity. You're like, wow, they have 500 species in their microbiome, but their pathobiont ratio to commensals is much higher, which means a lot of those 500 species are made up of organisms that can act pathogenically when their numbers are high. So we have to have that nuance as well. So high diversity with uniformity and a lower degree of pathobionts compared to commensals. And within those species, you also want to see certain keystone species at adequate numbers, right? So Faecalibacter prosnitzi, Akkermansia, Bifidobacterium longum, Rhuminococcus, these are important keystone species, and they're called keystone because they play such an important role in supporting the architecture of the entire microbiome, and they are inversely correlated with chronic disease with the host. So given that if you have that picture, then that's a perfectly healthy microbiome. You'll likely have perfectly healthy digestion. You'll have amazing resilience. And there's a very high chance you'll live past 100.
Real quick, I just wanted to interrupt this conversation and say it is not lost on me how lucky I am each and every day to get to have these conversations. And I hope you guys, as the listeners, know how much I appreciate the time that you take out of your day to listen to these conversations. And I hope you get as much value out of listening to them as I did creating them. If I could just ask one quick favor, it helps so much for shows like mine if you like, subscribe, comment, do all those things. That helps the algorithm know and realize that there's value here and pushes it to more listeners. And by doing that, that allows me to get even bigger guests, more well-known guests, and have more conversations for you guys. I appreciate what you do so much. I appreciate the time that you take to listen to these conversations so much. I couldn't be here without you guys. Thank you. Now let's get back to the conversation. Very interesting. Is there any telltale signs that we should be aware of? Do I need to take a test for this to determine if my gut's healthy, or is there some things that I could be looking out for in my day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, there's the good thing about the gut is it's loud and it speaks, right, if you will. And I mentioned, before that gut health goes well beyond digestive function, but digestive function is a part of gut health. So often that can be the initial canary in the coal mine that is screaming out that something is wrong. Right. And it's things like just basic indigestion, poor frequency of bowel movements. If you're somebody that's, having a normal bowel movement once every 3-4 days, that's not normal for almost anybody, right? And so that's something to look into. How your stool looks can tell you a lot about what's going on in your gut, right? In fact, there's a new company that has come out, and the name is escaping me. They just sent me one of their devices, and it's a camera for your toilet.
Oh, I've heard
And
about that. Yeah.
right, yeah, it's fascinating. I've had a chance to sit down and chat with the founder, and there's some really good science behind it. And why would they do that? Well, because actually, looking at visuals of your stool can tell a lot of stories about what's going on in your digestive tract, thus in your gut and in your microbiome, right? So some of the things you can look for on your own before you ever get a camera is your stool floating or does it sink, right? What is the color of it? Is it darker or is it super light? If it's and I'll explain what some of these things mean, right? So there's some context to it. For example, if your stool is floating and instead of sinking, then you know that the formation of the stool is compromised. So you're not getting adequate peristaltic activity and squeezing, and you're also not absorbing your fat very well, and that can often lead to floating stools. And then you may also see an oily residue at the top of the water in your toilet bowl. If the stool sinks like it should, then you've got really good compact stool. Your micronutrient and your macronutrient digestion is good and solid. You're making and forming really solid stools, and you want it to sink because it has a higher density than the water itself. The coloration of the stool makes a difference as well. So if the stool's not brown to dark brown, that means you're not producing adequate bile. And which means your liver may be compromised. And then as a result of not producing adequate bile, your gut microbiome can be compromised as well. And your ability to neutralize toxins, your ability to absorb fat soluble nutrients, all of those become compromised. So you'll see in a lot of elderly people, their stools look very white or very light in color, right? Now that can be, and what you're looking for is trends. Don't look at one stool sample and freak out about anything, because what you're looking for is a trend over time, because any given stool sample can shift a little bit based on what you ate, right? So if I, for example, ate a virtually no fat meal at all, and then, I looked at my stool later on, whenever it passes for that meal, it may look very light in that case from a color perspective, because I didn't need to release as much bile, because I didn't have a lot of fat in the meal, right? So don't be alarmed with things. You also, of course, want to look for blood and samples of blood in the stool. That's really important. You want to look at the formation and the structure of the stool. Everyone's familiar with the Bristol stool chart, right? That tells you a lot about how well your colon's absorbing moisture and water, how well your colon is forming the stool. It tells you a lot about the health of your colon. So there's a lot you can tell by just looking at your poop, and then how your body digests things. So whether or not you have a significant number of foods that you're intolerant of, do you get a lot of gurgling and rumbling and distress in your gut when you eat, or when you eat certain things, and then of course anything immunological related is often somehow tied back to the gut, right? So, for example, if you have a lot of, allergies or, immune dysregulation, so you get eczema, psoriasis, you've got a lot of foods you're sensitive to from an allergic perspective, a lot of those come back to the gut. And then the other things that are very telltale are brain-related issues. So if you have a lot of brain fog, if you have anxiety, if you have depression, if you have a lot of fatigue and memory issues, a lot of those are tied directly to disruptions going on in your gut. And for the most part, if you have a disruption in your gut, you likely have low diversity in your gut microbiome. That tends to be one of the first things that goes wrong with the gut microbiome, right? So all of those are things that you could start to glean answers from and go, okay, I likely have a dysfunctional gut and it's likely diversity. So you don't have to go and do a test. You can just start working on diversity and see if those things improve.
Cool. you mentioned like allergies and food intolerances. If we were to move our gut more to the right, more healthy, more diverse, would we see a decrease in allergies and sensitivities? Our body's more able to tolerate?
Yes, you should.
Cool.
And for a couple of reasons. So number one, um, there's a type of immune cell called a Treg cell, which is a regulatory T cell. This
Hmm.
T cell conducts a very important function of suppressing unwanted immune responses in the body, and this can be anything from responses to environmental particles, to food antigens, or even to your own tissue in the case of autoimmune disease. This is a very, very important part of our functionality and survival. And in fact, it's so important that the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology was given to the three scientists that discovered the Treg system. And this was the Nobel Prize in 2025, just last year. And so the Treg system, however, is very much dependent on a robust, healthy, diverse microbiome, right? So if your microbiome is low in diversity and you have high pathobionts, you're going to have a suppression of the Treg function, which makes you much more susceptible to unwanted immune responses to things like food and environmental particles and even your own tissue, right? So, in that way, if you start improving your microbiome and the diversity, the Treg system starts to improve its functionality, and then it can go about suppressing all those unwanted responses.
That's so cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
What are some, I mean, to just get into it, what are some ways we can increase that diversity in our gut?
Yeah. The good thing is there's a number of things you can do, and the other good thing is it's never too late. You could be 85 years old and had a life full of whiskey and hot dogs and antibiotics, and still improve the diversity of your microbiome. So it's never too late. And one of the first things you want to do is start to diversify your diet, right? So what you eat has a massive impact on the status of your microbiome and what the ecosystem looks like. So you want to start expanding the diversity of your diet, especially in the plant-based categories, right? So if you're looking at fruits and vegetables and roots and tubers and things like that, right? So adding new ones into your diet on a regular basis. You don't have to eat a lot of it. You just have to eat a good variety. The second part of it is adding fiber into your diet. So you want both soluble and insoluble fiber. So you could start with as simple as psyllium husk. Psyllium husk does improve some of the digestive function and the regularity. It's not very fermentable, so it does support the microbiome to a certain degree, but it's not the best fiber if you really want to grow your microbiome. If you really want to grow your microbiome, you'd look at fibers like something called PHGG, partially hydrolyzed guar gum, arabinogalactans, pectins, inulin, those types of things. Or, of course, also getting your fiber from foods, right? So fruits and vegetables and so on also provide, nuts and seeds provide a lot of good fiber. So you want to get your fiber intake upwards of 40 grams per day, 45 grams per day. That's a great goal because there's actually some really, really good data around that, right? So there's a couple of really big meta-analysis studies. So the latest one looked at almost 900,000 patients worth of data. And what they found was that every 10 grams of fiber you add to your daily diet, it reduces your all-cause mortality. That means dying from any disease
Mhm.
or anything outside of, obviously getting hit by a bus or something, all-cause mortality by 10%.
Mm,
Right? And that's all the way up to 40%. So everybody right now has the power to reduce their risk of dying from anything, any disease condition, any health related condition by 40%.
crazy.
Right?
Yeah.
That's massive.
Yeah.
If that was a pill that we were selling, it'd be $1 trillion product,
Yeah.
right? Like you're almost cutting your risk of dying from things in half.
Hmm.
And so all you have to do is kind of reduce fiber, increase fiber to that 40 gram level.
What's really interesting, the Finnish studies about saunas too have like a 40%
Hmm.
increase in all-cause mortality when done above certain temperature for 4 times a week. So you start to stack these things and you really
Yep.
start to set yourself up for success. What's also really interesting, I've had some carnivore people on, like Dr. Anthony Chaffee on, and he talks, about all just carnivore eating red meat, and he talks about how the body doesn't need fiber and how we don't need these vegetables. It's so interesting. And I've had other doctors on, like Dr. Joel Furman, who's very plant-based. He's like less than 5% of your calories should come from animal-based foods, and he talks about, again, the diversity and the importance of like fiber and these green things. It's so interesting to see how you have people who are medically trained or who are, studied in these things, and they still can't agree. Like they're often reading the same papers, but they come to different conclusions. It's very frustrating for the layman.
It is, and I'll say this, it frustrates me too, especially when it comes to diet, right? Because for some reason, people have become very activist minded when it comes to the diet of their choice. Um, and generally, this is my thinking. If someone's entire persona is based on a diet, you can't really believe what they're saying, right? Because they have to cherry pick information to support their persona. So, like, what's his name?
Paul Saladino.
Saladino, yeah. He was a vegan at first, right? That was his whole thing, and then he became the carnivore MD. And the thing is, like, he created his entire personality around being a carnivore, and so it's hard to go back. But he, in fact, has gone back, as you probably have seen. Now his diet is way more diverse. He's adding fruits and vegetables and all that to his diet. I think in large part because he's getting some health scares. He's probably looking at some blood work and going, "Oh my God, this is actually not good." And so I would really look at what the research is saying. And you're totally right that people can look at similar studies and kind of tweak out and pull out different things. And so what we really have to look at is like the collection of research, right? There is no empirical or research support for the idea that no fiber in your diet is beneficial in any way at all, right? There's none. Now, some of the carnivore people will cite like Inuit Indians, right? They'll say, well, look at the Inuit Indians. They survive predominantly on seal blubber, right? Well, that's actually not even true. And there's a couple of nuances there. Number one, Inuit Indians actually have genetic SNPs that in their choline function and so on that actually allow them to utilize fat in a way that's even different than us, right? If either one of us or anyone went and just started eating nothing but seal blubber, we'd be sick as can be, right? We wouldn't survive. But they have genetic SNPs that evolution, natural selection is selected for those SNPs. The other part of it that they never talk about is their diets actually contain a lot of wild berries and greens that are evergreen plants and fruits, and so they actually eat quite a bit of that. And in some times of the year they eat more of that than they eat seal blubber because it's hard to get seals, right? So yeah, it's crazy. And I'll talk about it from the perspective of the microbiome, which I think from a dietary perspective, that's the most important way to look at how you feed your system, right? Because it's the microbes that dictate how your body functions. And as a result, you have to feed your microbes. And absolutely, the predominance of microbes need plant-based material, right? Does that mean you have to be vegan or vegetarian? Absolutely not, right? You just need to have adequate fiber and polyphenol intake in your diet, both through supplementation, I would always recommend, so that you have a certain amount that you're getting, and certain diversity you're getting, and then the rest of it as much as you can from food, right? And it doesn't mean that steak is bad for you. It doesn't mean that meat is bad, and so hopefully people can see through that. But you're totally right in that it's absolutely frustrating when you get these contrarian views all over the place, right?
I was talking with Brian Sanders and Craig McClowski on here, and we came to the conclusion it's like we're camp, no camp. It's like as soon as you're in a camp, you then have to just
Totally
like listen to them and take what they're saying with a grain of salt, because you're exactly right. They have this persona and this identity that they need to reinforce through whatever way they go about doing that. So
and they'll do it. I mean, you'll see them, right? I mean, they will they'll take the smallest finite mouse animal study and validate their entire persona, and then there'll be this 500,000 patient meta-analysis study that contradicts their information, and they'll somehow ignore it or try to cherry pick something out of it. And I get it, like if
Mm,
you've built your entire following and all that around a diet, like you see, carnivore Mike and, vegan Jenny and like all of this stuff, right? Like if that's your whole persona, you're going to have to validate and continue to support that by cherry picking information.
So just to talk about food, diversity over quantity. So is it good to get like these like green blends that are like kale, spinach, things like that? And then like these, is there benefit to fresh food versus frozen food as well? Or are we getting the same?
Yeah. And when you say blends, you mean like the powder blends?
No, I mean
Oh,
like I could go to the store and buy like a bag of spinach, or I could go to the store and buy like a big mix of these things.
yeah, yeah. Got it.
Mm,
Yeah, a mix may make it easier.
mm,
And I think, in lieu of buying all of them separately and
mm-hmm,
kind of making your own hodgepodge, anything that makes it easier. And I think at the end of the day, the thing that I always try to tell people, and this is true, I think, of any diet related goals, right? Whether your diet related goal is to improve your microbiome and your health or for weight loss or whatever it is, the diet that's going to work is the one that you could stick to.
mm-hmm,
Right. So if you have this plan of becoming a chef and cooking all your meals from scratch and you start that on day one and day two, you're too tired and you have too many things to do, right? It's not going to work. Right. So if buying these mixes, frozen vegetables and all that, and just quickly thawing things, steaming things, whatever it takes to consume them, if that's the easiest route and the route that's most sustainable, then that's the route you should go with. There is some talk around frozen versus fresh vegetables, right? And same thing with fruits as well. Now, there's an argument to be made on an improved nutritional value of frozen
mm,
fruits and vegetables because normally they are flash frozen at optimum times during the nutrient availability in the vegetables and fruits. The fresh ones over time, they decline in their nutrient availability, right? And in fact, some of the nutrients may even change into things that are less beneficial. And so there is a great argument for doing frozen. And I have in my fridge right now, you'll see lots of bags of frozen berries and and fruits and all that. They go into smoothies really easily, right? I don't have to worry about them perishing. And then lots of bags of like frozen broccoli and frozen spinach and all of this stuff frozen because it makes it easy for me to add it to my meal,
mm-hmm.
right? And just keeping up with fresh stuff with the attrition rate is hard. In the summer, as we get farmers markets here in the Midwest, we will definitely go on a Saturday and buy some fresh stuff from a farmer's market and then try to use it over the next few days. But ultimately, people should just do what they can stick to consistently, which gives them the biggest variety
Mm-hmm.
in their diet.
Is there anything that we could be doing that negatively overrides the diverse foods that we're eating? Let's say I'm eating a diverse array of foods. What could I be doing that could be offsetting that or reducing the benefits of that?
Yeah. Well, so nothing will eliminate the benefit there, but there are things that can reduce some of the benefit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So some of it is around meal hygiene alone, right? So for example, I call this meal hygiene, and I don't mean the cleanliness of the meal. What I mean is your practices around eating.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple examples of that: not chewing your food adequately. Right. So not chewing your food adequately can actually have a negative consequence because number one, the act of chewing your food is the first part of digestion, right? It's that macerating of the food, especially when we're talking about plant-based foods. It's a macerating of the cellulose structures, which are hard for your body to break down because we don't make the enzyme cellulase, right? So we need to count on our teeth doing a lot of that grinding for us. And then once those structures are open, inside goes saliva, which has amylase in it, which is a kind of enzyme that starts to break down carbohydrate structures. Then you swallow it, goes into the stomach with hydrochloric acid that breaks it down even further, and then that allows that food to start becoming easier to absorb the nutrients and pull the nutrients out of it for our own benefit. And then once we pull all the nutrients out of it, then we want to leave the fiber to go into the colon where it can get fermented. If we don't chew our food adequately, a couple of things can happen. Number one, we don't get to pull all the benefits out of it. We don't get to assimilate the nutrients. Number two, we may not have broken it up enough for the microbes to ferment it properly either. Right. So the microbes need more access to the starchy carbohydrates that are inside the plants in order to ferment them as well. So they need that breakdown, that maceration of those structures as well. So chewing is so critically important. And a lot of people really chew inadequately because we're eating fast,
yeah,
right?
It's probably me.
Yeah, and we're eating on the go, and I'm totally guilty of that as well, right? And I notice myself swallowing really big bites of food from time to time, and I'm like, oh shit, I got to slow down and chew better, right? And relax and calm yourself. And then the other part of it is, what mental state are you in when you're eating? So everyone has heard of the sympathetic parasympathetic system, right? So sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. The reason why rest and digest is in there is because in order to turn on all the digestive switches, the release of bile, the release of hydrochloric acid, of pepsin, of the movement of the gut, all of these digestive switches, you have to be in that parasympathetic state. If you're in the sympathetic state, in the fight or flight state, you can't turn on all the digestive mechanisms, right? Which means that eating on the go, eating while you're watching things, being stressed while you're eating in some way or the other, not actually appreciating the food and so on. All of that keeps you in this in the sympathetic state, in the fight or flight state, and it negates a lot of the digestive function, so you're not getting the benefit out of the food. Then the third part of it is missing the what is the reflex called? I'm blanking right now, but it is the part of food where the smell and the taste and the texture of the food itself triggers digestive function in your body, right? We all get this. Like when we're hungry and you go to the grocery store, it's the worst time to go, right?
Yeah.
You're like salivating, looking at all the stuff around you. And then when you smell food, right, it turns on this autonomic reflex that starts creating digestive secretions that starts making you salivate, right? All of those are ways of turning on the digestive system by your brain activating the digestive process through sensory activation. So what we really should be doing, this is how we really should be eating, right? We take our time to prepare the food, right? So that there's a smell and a taste and a visual that's involved in that. It's called a cephalic response. Sorry, that was the thing I blanked on. So we can upregulate the cephalic response by smelling and looking at the food, and as we're preparing it, we're getting excited to eat it, right? So you want that cephalic response to start going. Then you sit down with your food, and sitting down is important because it helps you get into that parasympathetic state. Then you actually want to take a few deep breaths. And I know this sounds kind of hokey, but deep diaphragmatic breathing does help turn on the parasympathetic system, right? So you do want to take a few deep breaths and then just acknowledge that you're going to eat. And you're feeding your system and you're feeding your microbiome, and be aware of that, right? And then take small bites of food and chew it adequately and enjoy the food and enjoy the process of eating, right? And then all of that will help really gain most of the benefit from eating those healthy foods. So if you skip a lot of that and you're eating on the go, you're chewing too fast, you're not relaxed, you're not triggering the cephalic response, you're just grabbing a bar on the way out, those kind of things all negate a good portion of the benefit of the healthy food choices you're making.
What does chewing it adequately mean? Is there like a set amount of bites I need to be taking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's always been this like number that people went after, like chew it 32 times or something like that, right? I don't think there's any real scientific rationale behind that number. The way I try to gauge it is I try to make sure that when I'm chewing the food adequately, and I've chewed it in all sides of my mouth, right? Because you've got different types of teeth. You've got incisors and molars and all that. So you have different engineering functions. Like some of it is going to be grinding on the food, some of it's going to be cutting it sharper. And so you're chewing it adequately, you're coating it with enough saliva, which is also really important. And what I want to feel in my mouth is like the food has become the consistency of almost like an oatmeal, right? Like cut and boiled and hydrated oats. So it has to be kind of pasty and and soft and malleable. That's kind of what you want to feel in the mouth. If there's still chunks of food, and you can kind of judge that by moving it around and chewing it in different parts of the mouth, you want to become conscious of that and practice that, because once you practice it, it actually becomes a subconscious function. Right. Why it's hard for me is because I've always kind of eaten fast, and it's more subconscious for me to like chew 8 to 9 times and then swallow the whole thing. Right. And so when I take my time and I pay attention to it, I find that your mouth does a phenomenal job of sensing how well broken down that food is, if you're paying attention to it. And then I realize that if I pay attention to it on the first, say, 8 to 10 bites, then the rest of the meal, I don't really have to pay attention to it. It's automatic.
Friends, I'm jumping in real quick to tell you about today's sponsor, Nordic Wave. Nordic Wave makes premium cold plunges. We've talked a lot about heat exposure on the fact that I have a sauna, but on the other spectrum is cold exposure. And just as important, Nordic Wave makes premium cold plunges that get all the way down to 37 degrees Fahrenheit or heat up all the way to 104. That way you can get the hot and cold. These run 24/7 to keep the water clean with filtration and ozone injection. Now, I've been using mine each and every day, not only for the physical benefits. Yes, I recover better. Yes, I sleep good. Yes, I feel more energized. I've earned my dopamine, but for the psychological and mental benefits as well. It is hard to do something hard. But the fact is, when you do something hard, it becomes easier to do those hard things in the future, and you can accomplish even more difficult things than you ever thought possible. So head to Nordic Wave, use code Merrill at checkout. That's MERRILL to save you some money and start doing some hard things. All right, let's get back to the episode. I have a background of competitive athlete, competitive sport, and I was training for CrossFit 5-6 hours a day. And so there's a time when I was eating 5,000-6,000 calories a day. And so to get that, like, that's part of the sport. Like, eating enough food, it sucks. And so I used to have to be like, okay, I need to eat fast enough that I get the food down before I realize like I'm full. And so now I got in just that habit of just eating as fast as I could. That way I could get all the food that I needed to eat that day in my body. So that's something I have to override.
Yeah, it takes effort. You know, it's not easy, but it's a simple thing that can be done that will make a massive difference on your digestive function, your digestive process, turning on all the digestive signals, and then making all of the value of the food available to both you and your microbiome adequately.
Let's say somebody, I mean, this diversity of food and fibers helps the gut biome, helps the gut grow and flourish. What if it's already out of balance with more pathogenic, negative? Would we have to then kill that off before we start doing this, or will it naturally promote a healthy, good gut?
Yeah, so that is a very common misnomer that I've been working hard to undo, especially among clinicians, right? Because when information around the microbiome first started coming out, and then there was clear findings around like, oh, there are pathogens in the gut that could be problematic and so on, and that a typical unhealthy gut looks like it has higher levels of pathogens. The knee-jerk response to how to deal with that was much more of an allopathic-like response, which is, oh, if there's more bad bacteria, then obviously we have to kill them, and then we have to somehow get the good bacteria in, right? But the gut just doesn't work like that. In fact, when you look at the reasons why people feel dysfunction or they're at risk of disease, it's not necessarily the presence of the pathogens, but it's the absence of the commensals, right? Because it's the commensals that are conducting certain critical functions, and those functions aren't happening in that gut. And as a result of that, the gut is going into disarray. The pathogens can be adding to some degree the problem, but they're not like sitting there just producing endless toxins and poisoning the system, right? So it's not an infection. An infection is one that we have to think about going and killing and eliminating an infectious agent. These are your own native microbes that live there. We've just screwed up the proportions, and that the functionalities are now all off. Right. So if you see a gut that has higher pathobionts and lower commensals, and this individual has all kinds of digestive issues and immune issues and all that, it shouldn't be the strategy to go and try to kill down the pathogens, because what happens when you try to do that is you're going to knock everything down and the proportions will likely stay the same. Right. The goal is to alter the terrain, the environment, so you favor the growth of the commensals to come back.
Okay.
And the commensals do a better job of competing against the pathogens than we could, artificially do. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by what we've just been talking about, feeding the system the things it needs, right? The fibers, the polyphenols, the prebiotics, the resistant starches. There are some probiotics that do a fantastic job of seeking out the pathogens and suppressing their growth to a certain degree, and then supporting the growth of commensals, like the spore-based probiotics. That's why I spent the better part of my earlier career developing spore-based probiotics. It wasn't a thing before that, because of their ability to do something called competitive exclusion. That's the ability of these microbes to go in. They can read the microbial environment. They can identify the problematic organisms. They can sit next to them, and they can compete for resources. They can even produce some antimicrobials to bring down their numbers. So when we did studies on dysfunctional guts, what we found was that if you add, combination of prebiotics, fibers, and some of these spore-based probiotics, you can shift the microbiome very dramatically in a relatively short amount of time, in 3, 4, 5 weeks, right? You could start to see a dramatic shift occurring where these pathobionts are going down, commensals and keystones are coming up.
That's really interesting and good to hear. You always hear like, oh, I need to kill off everything in my gut, then I need to repopulate it with good bacteria, and it's this whole process, but that's all just nonsense.
It's all nonsense. It's just a hypothetical, based on lack of knowledge of how all of it works. Because the thing is, and here's the thing about microbes, right? They're incredibly resilient. You're never. That's why you look at all the harshest cleaning products in the world, right? Even like quaternary ammonias and all that. What do they say on the bottle? They say kills 99.9% of all germs, right? Why does it not say kills 100% of all germs? Because you can't, almost in any mechanism, kill all the germs, all the bacteria, or viruses. They're just so resilient. Some will always escape and remain there and remain in viable form. And that's absolutely true with your gut, with even more resilience, because there's a lot of layers of things that protect the microbes, like biofilms and all that. And so if you're going after the pathogens to try to kill them and kill them off, you might reduce their numbers temporarily, but within about 3 hours, they start to bounce back.
Really?
And so this whole we're going to eliminate all these bad guys, and then somehow the gut's just going to remain static like that until we repopulate it in one way or the other. Like, that's just such old, weird thinking to me that it never made sense from day one.
Just stuff that started and it's just been repeated so much that everyone just kind of accepts that as the reality, but that's not the case.
It just becomes dogma. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you mentioned probiotics. Before we dive into that, what is the difference between a probiotic and a prebiotic? What are the?
So there are scientific definitions. So a probiotic is a live microorganism when administered in adequate amounts confers a health benefit to a host. So in the case of a probiotic, it has to be an organism, a bacteria typically, that is alive and functions in a living manner within the gut, right? And the benefit of it comes from the bacteria itself, meaning it has some components or some capability of effectuating a benefit in the host. A prebiotic is a non-digestible complex carbohydrate that feeds specific beneficial bacteria in your gut. The reason why they can be selective in who they feed is because their carbohydrate structures are too complex and unique where that we can't break them down, so we can't absorb it. And many classes of bacteria can't break them down either. They just don't have the enzymes for it. So ultimately, I think everybody needs a prebiotic and a probiotic. And often you'll see the term symbiotic. That is when they've combined a prebiotic with a probiotic. The problem with that is most of the symbiotics on the market are kind of nonsense, because there is a expectation of what a symbiotic is. Like it has to be shown that the prebiotic that you put in there with this probiotic enhances the function of the probiotic. Right? That's a true symbiotic. You can't just throw any old prebiotic and any old probiotic together and call it a symbiotic. But that's what majority of companies do, unfortunately.
Okay. I've heard probiotics, doesn't matter. Everything's just going to die when you take it and by your stomach acid. Was there any validity to that, or what's going on there?
That's true for the vast majority of probiotics. When I first came into this marketplace, looking at probiotics like as a microbiologist would, I was really questioning the functionality of most of the probiotics, especially when you do these like kind of kitchen sink formulas with 15, 20, 25 strains in it. These are kind of like non-specific strains. I think the producers of these really have no idea what they do or even what they are, because they're not doing genetic analysis on all these strains to verify that they are Lactobacillus acidophilus, for example, or whatever the genus and species is. And so the rationale around like we just need a bunch of strains together, that means it's highly potent. There's no scientific support for that. And then the second part of it is that, any probiotic just survives and functions in the gut. And especially if we go higher and higher doses, 30 billion, 40 billion, 50 billion, there's no rationale behind that as well. It's very strain specific in terms of its functionality. So I would still say that the vast majority of probiotics, and we tested this in, I think it was 2016, so almost 10 years ago, we took the top 40 probiotics in the marketplace and we put them through gastric simulation, and we found that 98% of them all died in the stomach, right? And which means that into the intestines goes a whole bunch of dead bacteria, dead bacterial debris, bacterial genetics, and so on. And the thing is, you don't know what all that does unless they've been tested, right? And so, does that mean you need a probiotic to be alive in order to benefit? That's actually not true either, right? So then people might go, "Well, what the hell are you saying?" So there's a little bit of nuance here. If someone's calling something a probiotic, it has to be proven that it functions alive in the gut. That's the definition of a probiotic, right? A live microorganism. If there is a bacteria that can function dead in the gut and still confer a benefit, then it's actually called a postbiotic or paraprobiotic or ghost probiotic. There's a number of terms for it, but the official regulatory term is a postbiotic. And so that organism has some special feature. Normally it's on the outer cell wall that can act as a signaling molecule that can signal some benefits, right? But often those are done with single strains. They aren't in that 15, 20 strain hodgepodge stuff that you see at the store shelves, right? So if people are looking at probiotics, postbiotics, and all that, I would look at spore-based and other researched formulas of probiotics that have some evidence that they stay alive and they function as a result of that. And then there are some that are postbiotics that are dead organisms that also can have a powerful effect, but they are often done as single strains, maybe one or two strains in some formulations, right? Because when you have multiple strains, they can interfere with each other's signaling capability. So I would just say the vast majority of stuff that they see in retail really does not do anything.
So what's the difference between the one you help formulate and create the spore-based ones?
Yeah, so the spore-based ones, number one, they uniquely survive through the gastric system. So they survive 99.9% of the time, or 99.9% of the cells. Again, we can't say 100% because it's hard to identify every last bacterial cell. So 99% survival through the gastric system. They enter the intestines alive, and then they go to work modulating the microbiome in a very significant way. And then we also satisfy the second requirement to me, which is critically important for any probiotic formula, is that the finished formula has clinical trials on it, so that you're validating that the combination of strains that you have in there is actually synergistic, right? Because bacteria can knock each other's functions out, they can compete and so on. So you can't just throw random strains together and assume they're going to work well together. You have to have clinical data on the finished formula. So the spore-based probiotics we develop has survivability. It goes into the intestines alive. And when it's in the intestine, it can actually compete against dysfunctional bacteria. It can increase the growth of beneficial bacteria, increase the growth of keystone species, and also, very importantly, it helps reduce leaky gut. And we published two studies on leaky gut, 2 human trials on leaky gut on this formula.
That's really cool. Well, I mean, let's just classify what is leaky gut for those who don't know.
Yeah, your intestines have to be a permeable barrier, but it's a selectively permeable barrier, right? Because you want to let nutrients through and so on, but you don't want to let bacteria and pollutants and toxins and all that through, because if it's rolled through, it's going to end up in the liver and then in circulation. And so there are checkpoints and structural elements that allow that selective permeability in the lining of your gut. All of those elements are dependent on microbes in the gut microbiome. And so if the microbes become dismantled in some way or compromised, then those structural elements that allow the gut allow the gut to be semi-permeable then falls apart and then makes the gut hyperpermeable. So then now you've got lots of things leaking through that shouldn't be leaking through, like bacterial toxins, viruses, all this stuff that then wreaks havoc not only in the lining of your gut, but then throughout the body as well, systemically. Clinically, the most profound impact of leaky gut is the migrating through of a compound called LPS, which is lipopolysaccharide, right? It is a component of gram-negative bacteria, which gram-negative bacteria make up almost half of your microbiome. And when the gram-negative bacteria, when they're turning over, they're dying and all that, they release this LPS into the mucus layer of the intestines. If your gut is leaky, it tends to leak from the mucus layer past the intestinal lining and ends up in circulation. When this LPS is elevated in your system, it lays down the foundational risk for many chronic illnesses, right? So that is the clinical impact of leaky gut. And to me, the most important aspect when we talk about leaky gut is this, we call it endotoxemia. It is the migration of this LPS endotoxin from the lining of the gut into circulation.
So taking a proper or having a good prebiotic and probiotic and a diverse selection of foods can help reduce or even heal that leaky gut.
It can completely eliminate it. Yeah, we published that in 2 papers that published in major gastroenterology journals, where we can completely eliminate that hyperpermeability in the gut, which is really important because that hyperpermeability is the main driver in so many chronic conditions. In fact, there's a 2015 publication in Frontiers of Immunology by a couple of authors that reviewed all of the research around endotoxemia and this LPS leaking through and the disease processes that it can initiate. And they actually concluded that leaky gut and this translocation or migration of LPS is the number one cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide.
Really?
Right? Because it's an underlying factor in all of the most common conditions. Take diabetes, for example, right? There's been a number of studies, including studies published by the American Diabetic Association, showing that accumulation of that LPS in circulation is the primary insult that starts the process of insulin resistance. And then there was a study called the CardioPrev study, which was a 60-month study, right? So we're looking at like 5 years, a 60-month study following individuals that were pre-diabetic to see which biomarkers that they had within them were the most predictive of them falling into diabetes, and they found that only one marker was predictive, and that was the serum LPS levels. So how much of this endotoxin they had in their system. And then you look at issues like anxiety and depression, right? There's tons of studies on it. But one of the most profound studies is the Netherlands study on anxiety and depression. They were following people for 9 years, looking at all kinds of biomarkers to see which biomarkers were most closely associated with the presence of anxiety and depression. And they found only one, which was LPS. This lipopolysaccharide that leaks in from your gut. They found that even on 9 years worth of follow-up, if the individuals had high LPS, they had anxiety. And they could, in fact, predict the level of anxiety and depression by how much LPS they had. And if for some reason LPS went away because they modified their diet or whatever they may have done, in that 9-year period, the anxiety and depression went away as well.
That's so interesting. So somebody listening to this says, I'm convinced I'm going to start, increasing fiber. I'm going to have a diverse selection of food. I want to start taking a probiotic, prebiotic. Is there a proper or best time to take your probiotic and prebiotic? Should it be with food? Should it be in the morning?
If you're using the spore probiotic, right? So, and some people may go, which is the spore one? You can use Just Thrive probiotic, which is a spore-based probiotic that was involved in the studies. You just take it with your largest meal of the day, or any meal of the day for that matter. You don't have to be super precise about when you're doing it.
Okay, cool. Do you feel, I'm curious, with the advent of hyper-palatable foods, ultra-processed foods, let's take just Americans, has the gut moved more towards the left, more towards unhealthy over the past decades?
Yeah, in an alarming fashion. One of the things that keeps somebody like me up at night is like this mass extinction that we're seeing within our gut microbiome. There was actually a great book by a NYU microbiome researcher. His name is escaping me right now, but the book is titled "The Missing Microbe." And then him and another researcher put out a documentary about which was followed the book, and it was called like the mass extinction or the silent extinction or something like that, right? And what they were really talking about is the loss of certain species and groups of organisms from the Western microbiome, and the devastating impact that can have, right? So we look at our ancestors, right? Our closest ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, for example, foraging, hunting, gathering, eating nuts, seeds, everything. They're omnivores, if you will, right? Lived on the environment, on the earth, and got lots of dirt, incidental dirt, and all their food and all that. I mean, they would have, upwards of 700, 800, 900 different distinct species of microbes in their system. We've been, at Microbiome Labs, I had built a microbiome test, and we had done 15, 20, 25,000 tests before I had left. And we would see average diversities in the 120s. Right. So we've lost so many of our species. And the thing is, why that is alarming is because these microbes are the key things that afford us functionality, right? So our human system is dictated by our genes, right? Like our innate capabilities is based on the genes that we have. And so when we look at the human genome, we've got roughly 22,000 functional genes. And that might sound like a lot, but a cockroach has about 22,000 functional genes, right? And an earthworm has like 30,000 functional genes. So we're not that sophisticated when it comes to our genes, right? And our capabilities. But we have 2.5 million microbial genes in our system that come from the microbes in our gut. So the microbes afford us a lot of our needed functionality. And when we lose microbes, we lose that functionality, and we become more and more susceptible to disease, right? This is why you're seeing, increasing rates of allergies and asthma among kids, right? As they're being born, increasing rates of spectrum disorders and other dysfunctions, because we're losing microbes and we're losing the capability to function in our environment. And the analogy there, and it still hasn't sunk in for people. the analogy there I would give is, what if somebody told you that based on your behaviors and your choices, that your kids would be born with just one kidney,
Mhm.
right? And then their kids will be born with just one kidney and only half a spleen,
Huh.
right? Like losing organ systems from generation to generation. It's the same thing, because our microbiome is a massive organ, and in fact, houses more information about how to conduct, business as a human, than many of the organs in our system. And so if we lose them, we're losing functionality that we're supposed to be passing on to the next generation, right? So it becomes incumbent upon each of us to try to preserve our ecosystem as much as we can, because it's our job to preserve this ecosystem that has been fought and died for over the centuries from our ancestors, right?
Is a contributing factor also maybe the increased sterility of our environment, washing hands, hand sanitizer all the time, not going out in nature, not playing around in dirt, getting dirty?
Yeah, that was actually the main premise around that book. Sorry, the author came to me now, Martin Blazer,
Mm.
the Missing Microbe book that I mentioned. That's the premise around it, is the hygiene hypothesis.
Okay.
The hygiene hypothesis saying that we have, specifically and strategically avoided encounters with microbes on a day-to-day basis. We've over-sterilized our environments. We've over-sterilized our food. We certainly no longer have the same osmotic relationship with the environment, where we're shedding microbes into the environment and we're picking up lots of microbes into the environment. And all of that has a massive impact on your microbiome. For that, some of the easy, and also, in fact, I'll just mention this. There's some studies that have actually shown this to be quite true. So I'll cite 3 studies. Number one, studies on comparing people in similar geographies, that people that live in rural areas versus urban areas, right? They
Mhm.
see that people in the rural areas have much higher diversity within their gut microbiome than people in urban areas, because the people in rural areas are outside more and have more contact with the land. That's one. The second line of evidence you look at it is households that use chlorine-based cleaners on all or most of surfaces have kids with a higher incidence rate of allergies, asthma, and viral infections,
Interesting.
right? And then the third line of evidence of that is households that have dogs actually have kids with lower incidence rates of asthma, allergies, and viral infections. And in fact, a study in January 2020, showed that if you brought a dog into your home, it actually increases your longevity. And that could be in part because of the oxytocin and the bonding and
Mhm.
all of that stuff, but it's also in large part because of the immune system and what happens with your immune system when you bring an animal that runs outside and rolls around in the grass and all that, and jumps all over your furniture and inoculates your home with the biome,
Mhm.
right? So that is a really, really important component of it. So I'm glad you brought that up. So 3 workarounds for that for people. Number one, get a dog, right? That in itself, and dogs are fantastic.
Yeah.
If you're a cat person, I'm sorry, but dogs are a little bit cooler. Cats are fine if you want to have them, but they have a lot of attitude. I remember I had a cat in high school, and he was just a little asshole.
Hey.
He
Yeah.
just didn't care about anything. And then I've had dogs since, and they're just the most lovable things in the world, right?
Mhm.
So if you can get a dog, it actually helps quite a bit. Number 2, don't sterilize most surfaces in your home, right? So my desk and countertops and all these shelves behind me and all that only ever get wiped with a cloth with water, just to dust it. And sometimes the water might put a couple drops of essential oil just to have a little smell, but that's it. Like, yes, the toilet gets, cleaned out properly. Shower, if it's getting moldy, will get cleaned out properly. Kitchen counter, if you bring, raw chicken home and you get chicken juice on it, of course, sterilize it. But other than that, you don't need to sterilize most of your environment in your home. And then the third part of it is when you go outside for walks and things like that, touch and grab as many things as you can, right? It's very innate for us as humans. You see it in kids, right? You take a kid out on a walk on a trail, they're picking up every rock and dirt and stick and all that, right? That engagement with nature is a very innate thing with us, and it's part of the way we get exposed to microbes in a beneficial way. And then if you could sit down and eat in nature, that actually really helps as well.
Cool. Yeah. I mentioned earlier, got a background of sport and weightlifting and things like that. In that area particularly, you have people who put protein forward. They make sure they're getting enough protein, and that comes with what we coin protein farts, just rancid, nasty. Why is that? Why are people who are maybe higher in protein having these rancid farts?
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple of things. One of them is just kind of an inconvenient thing, and the other one is actually a potentially dangerous issue, right? So when you break down protein, one of the things you release is ammonia. And ammonia is part of what makes these protein farts really noxious. And then some of it is also putrefaction. So when you're taking a lot of protein and you're consuming a lot of protein, you don't necessarily digest and assimilate all of it. And so you may get peptides and short chain amino acids entering into the large bowel where it can get fermented. But the fermentation of protein in the large bowel is more like putrefaction. And so you get this rottening of the protein. You add that to the ammonia gas that's building, and those farts just smell absolutely terrible, right? That putrefaction is not necessarily a good thing, and the building up of ammonia is not a great thing because it stresses the liver. It can increase the pH in the gut, which can then support the growth of pathogens. So it can create a bunch of havoc in the system. The other issue with it is it pushes your system more towards what we call proteolytic fermentation. Proteolytic fermentation is the type of fermentation that occurs when you consume high protein. The problem with proteolytic fermentation is that there's a lot of noxious byproducts that are produced from proteolytic fermentation, like compounds like P-cresol, which can be very inflammatory in the system, right? Ammonia is another one of those. But there's a number of those kind of inflammatory, toxigenic compounds that come about from proteolytic fermentation. And then it also suppresses the growth of the microbes that do the saccharolytic fermentation, which is the other end of fermentation, which is where you ferment fibers into short chain fatty acids, into butyrate and so on. And so, I think there is absolutely a danger in over consuming proteins, especially if you're not balancing those proteins with fiber. Right. And so if somebody's obsessed with protein and they need to get, maybe like 150 grams per day or something, whatever it is, their target, milligram or gram per kilogram or gram per pound, people I hear fluctuate between both of those, which is a 2.2 difference, which is, they're not really interchangeable numbers. Right. Yeah. And so if you're going for those kind of goals, you need to make sure you're getting your 45 grams of fiber a day as well, because you cannot shift your microbiome towards mostly proteolytic fermentation. That won't be good for your system in the long term.
Interesting. So somebody has these rancid farts, maybe tone back off the protein a little bit and increase the fiber a little bit, and that you should see a reduction and that goes away.
Exactly. Yep.
Super interesting. What is there any benefit or detriment to fasting, like not eating any food for a while?
Yeah, there are known benefits to it, and even benefits to the microbiome. Actually, especially if you do intermittent fasting, to me, there's diminishing return when you go too long. So if you go, say, 42 hours or 48 hours, 72 hours and so on, I think you start to get in this realm of having diminishing return. But an intermittent like fasting, which means, anywhere from 14, 15 hours every day, most of it through the night, there's actually great benefits for the microbiome. Because in a fasted state, you can actually build diversity. And it's counterintuitive, but the thing that helps people understand that is, you have to understand that the microbiome has many layers of fermenters, right? So what does that mean? You've got the primary digesters that take the big macromolecules that come in and they break them down, and then they produce these metabolites that then feed the next layer of microbes, and then they produce metabolites that feed the next layer of microbes, and so on. So there's a layering effect of the types of microbes and the types of substrates that are produced. Um, if you feed the system too often, you stop some of those further layers of fermentation, right? So if you've got the primary guys that have fermented the big stuff, right, the big fibers and starches that have come through, and then they've kind of gone to rest because they've produced enough secondary metabolites, then all of a sudden there's another flood of those primary metabolites coming through. Then these primary fermenters activate again, and the secondary ones have to get suppressed. You can't have all the microbes turned on at the same time in the system, right? There just isn't space for all of that. And so you want to give your system time to go through the full cascade of digestion, fermentation, and then you also want to turn on the housekeeping genes. So your gut works on a diurnal system like our circadian clock, and what that means is that when we go to sleep at night, your gut goes into kind of repair, rejuvenation mode, right? Housekeeping mode. And so you want that time for those genes and those microbes to kick on so you can clean out the system, and the migrating motor complex goes through and it sweeps everything out and, removes debris and all that good stuff. So that stuff doesn't happen if you don't have adequate fasting time as well.
That's really interesting. It's always funny how much everything falls onto the same, like, you rebuild, you grow when you rest. Like, the work doesn't happen in the gym. The growth happens when you're not in the gym, when you're resting, So it's always
Totally.
interesting to hear. Well, Karen,
And just keep in mind, so, food and eating food is a massive task for your system, right? It's no different than going out to the gym and cranking out 20 sets of stuff. It's a big stress and load to your system, and you have to rest from that to recover. No different with eating, dealing with food, which is why we get sleepy when we eat a big meal, which is why, like your system diverts so much energy towards a digestive function, because it takes a lot. It's very taxing. And so you have to have rest periods from that for the system to recover.
It's really interesting. People don't even think about, like, the thermogenic effect of food, like the calories that you take to burn the calories that you just consumed. And it's really interesting when you get down that route and you realize, your body's working. It's working hard when you eat this food. Well, Kiran, this has been one of the most actionable, like, just information after information podcasts I've done.
Yeah.
I learned a ton, and there's a ton that I'm going to implement starting today after this. I need to increase, I've started to increase the diversity of my fruits and vegetables. I always try to buy, oranges, kiwis, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, all these vegetables as well. So I'm just going to keep increasing that diversity as well. But I like to close every podcast with two questions. The first being, who do you think I should speak to next and why? And then the second is based off a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote: if we encounter a man of rare intellect, we should ask him what books he reads. What's a book you'd recommend for me?
Yeah, both great questions. Let's see, who should you speak to next? There's so many good people out there whose work I love. I would recommend you speak to Dr. Emran Mayer.
Okay.
And I'm happy to put you in contact with him. He is a medical doctor, but he's focused a lot of his work on microbiome related research, on things like aging and the impact of polyphenols and all of that. He's done some amazing work. And the thing is, most people would never have heard of him, despite all of the contributions he's made into the literature for all our health and wellness benefits, right? So one of my goals is to get people like him more, into the spotlight, because they've dedicated their whole professional career to adding to the collective knowledge, and they often don't get any sort of recognition for it. Not that he's asking for recognition, but I think he's really passionate about talking about his work. So he's somebody you should really have on your show. when it comes to books, so you may be surprised that I actually don't read a lot of books at all. And one of the reasons I don't read a lot of books is because I read a lot of papers,
Hmm.
right? And so I end up spending a lot of my time reading research papers and not having time to read
Yeah.
books. But the books that I have found that have really helped me in my thinking, they're not directly related to the work that I do, but they really help you in how you think about the world around you, your life, and so on, is books around quantum physics
Mm.
and quantum mechanics. And you don't have to do like there's complicated books like Schrodinger's cat, which is a more complicated, focus on the mathematics kind of book around quantum mechanics. But then there are books like Quantum Mechanics for Dummies,
Yeah.
which are fascinating. And the reason why those kind of books can have an impact is because they are talking about this really esoteric, nuanced science that governs everything around us that we're not even aware of,
Hmm.
right? That most people aren't aware of. But we get little clues of some of these things, right? So, it just as a very primitive example, like we all have had deja vu before, and then
Hmm.
you go like, what the hell is deja vu? And then you look into quantum mechanics, and it starts to make some sense, like where these kind of experiences can come from. It also helps you shape your mindset because you start to realize that reality is a little bit of a fleeting thing, right?
Hmm.
That what we perceive as reality really exists as a probability wave, and how that wave collapses into the reality that you're seeing is based a lot on how you measure the outcome,
Mm.
right? And so it really helps with like mindset and all, and like, being able to view life and your work and all that in on different perspectives. um so I love those kind of books that invoke thinking. And I get all my knowledge from research papers,
Hmm.
so I don't use books for that. I use research papers for that. But then I get all of my challenging thinking and all that from books around things like quantum
Mm.
mechanics and so on.
Amazing.
I have, and so I would definitely look at that, and everyone should read at least one book on quantum mechanics in their life.
Mhm. I just finished the Almanac of Naval Ravikant, and in the back he recommends he's very well read. In the back he recommended the same thing. He's like, stop reading these self improvement whatever books. Like read
Yeah,
books on like quantum mechanics, macroeconomic, like these big like
totally.
encompassing topics. And then he's like, if you are feeling like you need to read something else, read the classics, read Dostoevsky, read Tolstoy, read those. So yeah, I've definitely been shifting more to that as well. So it's been really good.
Yeah,
Where Go
and
ahead.
I even like actually, just reading books on or quotes of like Marcus Aurelius, for
Mm,
example,
yeah, the
right? It's
meditations.
just
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. There's just some profound stuff in there
Hmm.
that really gets you to think, and I think that's one of the things I try to glean out of a book is it's invoking thought in
Hmm.
me.
Yeah, things that tell you or teach you how to think, not like what to think, are beneficial.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Kieran, like I said, this has been an amazing podcast. Where can people follow you? Where can they get more exposure to your work and to your information?
Yeah, reach out on Instagram or follow on Instagram. My handle there is Kiran Biome, KIRANBIOME. I also have a kind of a learning institute called the Biome Learning Center. The website is Biome LC, BIOMELC. There's a free circle community on there
Hmm.
that I've assembled, which has lots of practitioners on there, lots of consumers. We post a lot of great information on there for people to learn. This course information on the microbiome, lots of free stuff. So that's another great place to come and join kind of a microbiome community.
Amazing. I'll have links to both your Instagram and your website just down in the description, guys. So just go click that. Uh, this was a pleasure. I really appreciate your time. I learned a ton.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to do it. Thank you so much for having me.